Welcome everyone. Welcome. Good evening. Welcome to this first session of the four-part series entitled Mass Violence, Making Sense of Mass Violence. My name is Maxim Kupovykh. I teach sociology and national studies at AUC. And together with my colleague, Erica Rossini, just here. We've been working hard to put this together. I will serve as the moderator today, and in 2 months approximately, and Eric will take over our 2 daily sessions. The speaker throughout this series will be Professor Swaan, whom I will introduce in a minute. First of all, I would like to welcome AUC audience, live audience, if possible, eventually online audience. I have to, warn you that we're not the wizards of this kind of technology, and it's all been set up over the last some reason that doesn't want to cooperate. The online part of the show is an experiment, so feedback or any help for the remaining 3 sessions is very welcome. Now, a few words about the kind of rules of engagement for today's session. Professor Swaan will be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a short break, like 10 minutes, and then we'll get back to have a Q&A session. You are welcome to ask questions while the professor is talking. So then it's up to him to take your question or answer it or not, or maybe answer it a bit later. So don't expect immediately immediate reaction. But you will be obviously no question will be addressed. So hopefully we will also get some questions from online, and I will read them. So now, once again, the title of this session, of this whole series, is Making Sense of Mass Violence. This is not a jolly topic, so really, you suggested there might be some dancing during the break. It was not planned, and maybe in tune with the topic of the series. Doesn't mean that we have to be all grin. Nevertheless, it's important to realize that this topic is probably more relevant than 2 years ago, when this series was originally conceived, announced, and actually started. In fact, today is the second reiteration of the first session of the series. It actually once already happened 2 years ago in March 2020, on the last day before the lockdown. Exactly the last day before the lockdown, Thursday before the lockdown, Friday at the beginning. So the current series is a kind of celebration of the fact, or in this sense, instead of dancing, but celebration of the fact that the lockdown period is finally over. On the other hand, the title of this series and the topic is unfortunately emblematic of the fact that we, the 21st century humanity, still have a lot to learn from and about the history, and specifically the history of the massacres of the 20th century. Some people may say, well, let bygones be bygones. Well, arguably, just when we began to feel comfortable saying that, the bygones have returned, and returned arguably with vengeance. Here's where Professor Swaan entered with his enormous experience and expertise of sociologists, social psychologists, and psychoanalysts. The experience and expertise of examining and understanding why and how people kill each other on a large scale, and what can be done about this. Now, a few words about Professor Swaan. He's an emeritus distinguished research professor for social sciences at the University of Amsterdam, and he held the chair of sociology from 1973 to 2001. And the Professor Swaan studied and practiced psychoanalysis from 1973 to 1984. He founded and served as the chairman of the Amsterdam School for Social Research, which is a premier research institution on a national and European level. For many years, he was a columnist for the Dutch newspaper Handelsblad. He's been also a visiting professor at places like Sorbonne, Collège de France, Cornell University, and Columbia University. He is not only an academic, but also a renowned writer and essayist. He got something like an Dutch analog of the Pulitzer Prize. This is to Paris, at some point for his life work of essay writing. He's authored quite a few books, but one book is particularly important for our series. Just remember it. I wanted to bring it somehow. I forgot, but I will try to bring it next time. And you have it? Yes. The Killing Compartments on the Mentality of Mass Murder. It was published in 2015. And recently, most recently, a French collection of his essays came out in Paris. My acquaintance with the professor dates back to his master classes at AUC 8 years ago or so. He's an old friend of our college. Over the years, he generously shared his knowledge, his ideas, and his most latest research with us. I'm delighted to help him back with not just one, but a series of contributions to AUC's intellectual life. So today's title of today's introductory session is Social Groups in Conflict. Once again, welcome, Professor. The floor is yours.
All right. And we're going to talk about probably the saddest subject in the world, which is mass violence and mass extermination. Because we're talking about a particular kind of mass violence, which is usually often called genocide. We'll talk about that term later on. But it is asymmetric mass violence. It's not two regular armies which are more or less balanced. Or just after or during wars, civil wars, revolutions, there's already major upheaval. And thirdly, if you look well and hard, you'll find the state as the actual perpetrator of the violence, or as the hidden facilitator of the violence, or at least as the complicit condoning instance. So there's almost always the open or hidden hand of the state. That is the kind of violence we're going to talk about. Then you can ask me, what is mass? How many people should be killed before it counts as mass violence? and I'm not going to answer the question. A lot. Too many. Yeah, let's say too many. So maybe 100,000. We have had instances of 100,000, millions of people, tens of millions of people being exterminated. Many, many. Now, the title of this course series is making sense of what is maybe the most senseless phenomenon I can think of. Mass killings of unarmed, not really threatening people for goodness what reason. But let us try to see what can be said about these instances. And in a later stage, I will be more precise about what sort of forms of mass violence there are, how they relate to the concept of genocide, and if there are some kind of regularities in these events. But first, let us try and put this whole phenomenon of mass killings in a long-term historical context. And then maybe one of the first things we should grapple with is the word that has already been said, the word states. I'm not going to define states, I'm going to make a few remarks about the emergence of states. Because states in the contemporary form, as we know them, are a rather recent phenomenon, going back maybe 5-6 centuries. And usually, when we say state, we really think in the back of our mind nation states, states which have a population that somehow considers itself, is considered as more or less homogeneous, similar, and made into the image of the states. There's a beautiful book by Eugene Weaver, and even the title is inspiring. It's called Peasants into Frenchmen, or how the French state made peasants who hadn't the slightest idea that they belonged to the state in Paris, side. And they thought they were Bretons, or they were Provençal, whatever. And they were made by a certain machinery into citizens of the French states. And the first machinery, of course, was education. The machinery you find yourself in right now, the very top of the machinery. Norbert Elias has written a beautiful book on the process of civilization, über den Prozess der Zivilisation, the civilizing process, in which he devotes a number of chapters of the first volume in how these states emerged. And he paints a picture of small warring units, you could call them fiefdoms or little kingdoms, not too large, who were forever fighting each other, trying to make treaties, gang up together against a third party, and who found themselves in a state of what Norbert Elias, E-L-I-A-S, called a state of free competition, a free-for-all, or maybe even a war of everyone against everyone. Who knows where that comes? I didn't make it up, somebody else did. Bellum omnium contra omnes. I think you know it. Yes, yeah, of course, Thomas Hobbes. It's a very old expression. And in the idea of Norbert Elias, gradually out of this war of every fiefdom against every other fiefdom, emerge larger entities. And some fiefdoms are victorious, they make lucky alliances, and they succeed in subduing other fiefdoms, and larger entities are created. And at some point in the idea of Norbert Elias, one of those entities becomes so large that basically you cannot anymore win a war without it. So it is sort of a necessary partner. Think in the contemporary world until 20 years ago, or maybe even still today, we'll find out. You couldn't really win a war without the United States. The United States has no monopoly of world power, but it's very difficult to win a war against it. Or at least that was so, we'll see, we'll find out. Now, such a dominant entity then becomes the center of all competition. It's no longer a competition of everyone against everyone else, but it becomes a competition for the favor of the one large dominating entity. And Norbert Elias called that bounded competition, limited, bounded competition, bounded to the favor of, etc. This was, for example, the situation in, say, the 16th century with the French court, that almost all other nations, there were no nations yet, all other entities somehow had to vie for the favors of the French court, at least in Western Europe. And the great noblemen of the time sent their sons to be educated at the French court or at the Spanish court, those were the competitors. But in fact, these sons who were going to be educated in courteous manners were hostages, so that the outlying fiefdoms, the outlying small noblemen would not rebel against the central court. So gradually you see the emergence of much larger entities, and in Europe that was, for example, Spain, France, England. Germany remained much longer, and Italy remained much longer divided in warring and smaller entities. Russia became at a rather early, a very large. Italy and Germany became coherent state only in the 19th century. The other, so there is what emerges are states with well-defined frontiers, which are forever subject of contention, and an enormous machinery. And in these states, you had a court, and all the nobility vied for the favors of the court, sent its sons to become courtiers, and this is the very original insight of Norbert Elias. In the court, there was a change of manners and mentality, mentalité. Because if before young noblemen were warriors and they were proud of their honor, their martial prowess, their readiness to fight for their honor at any moment, take up the sword and kill and act as if they were not afraid of being killed. They were impulsive and ferocious warriors. At the court, things became different because you could no longer afford to pick a fight and to kill another courtier. You were supposed to look at the high nobility, at the marshals, at the princes, the king himself, and see what way the wind was blowing, and to try to gain the favor of the mighty rulers of the realm. In other words, they became courtiers. And the word courtois, or courtly, in our languages mean well-mannered, how should I say, subtle, knowledgeable in the ways of the world, a courteous person, which is very different from a warrior, who is a rude. So there is a transition from the warrior world to the courtier world. in the view. And that is a very important change in the mentality of the European upper crust. Probably this may have happened much earlier in Japan or China, and there are now studies about the court life of Japan and China in the perspective of which lies, but we're still waiting for the outcome. But in Western Europe, this happened between the 16th and the 18th century. And then, one of the things, if you have to know which way the wind is blowing, where the favors are going, it means you have to look and see how people look at you. If they smile, if they watch you at all, if they ignore you, or if they say, good morning, my young friend, or something. So you have to look at what the other people, and you have to dissimulate your own emotions. Certainly your anger, your impatience. And you must avoid to be laughed at or to be ridiculed. There's a beautiful movie called Ridicule, which is set at the court of Louis XIV, and you see all the movie, there are country noblemen, rather rude and uncouth people, that they have to come to the court and to have ask for a favor or permission or some kind of title, and they sit there all day long in a sort of waiting room, and any moment, they sit there for weeks, any moment the king's marshal may summon you and you are given an audience with the king. So there you sit for weeks as a country nobleman. And one of those country noblemen, after having sat out for 3 weeks, decides to take off his shoes and his socks and put on clean shoes. And at that moment, the king summons him. And there he goes on his bare feet into the royal audience room, and he is completely ridiculous. And he hangs himself. So we see the impact in this film of a change of morals, a change of changement des mœurs. What's mœurs? Customs, yeah, customs. Except that it also is connected with morals. So customs and morals, yes. Ridicule, one of the most horrible feelings to be laughed at, to be ridiculous. So it is at these points that a more psychological view of man emerges, because you have to control your emotions, dissimulate, and guess what other people are trying to convey and hide from you. So a transition of human ways of dealing with one another. And then in the 18th century, the bourgeoisie, not noble, but well, class that have land and money, begin to look at the courtiers and adopt their ways of dealing. And there's a beautiful, very funny play, even today it's still very funny, by Molière, Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme. Anyone of you knows it? The Bourgeois Gentilhomme is a man not very educated and not very refined, but he has some money and he married the right woman, and now he wants to become from bourgeois gentilhomme. And so he has a dancing teacher, and he's a teacher who teaches him to sing. It's very funny, and you see in real time, in the 18th century, how the bourgeois try to adopt the courtly manners, and the play is written in the perspective of a court playwright, and of course the bourgeois gentilhomme is ridiculous, and he is an uncouth, rude man who doesn't know how to dance, or doesn't know how to court the ladies. Again, it was court. And so he makes a fool of himself in front of the theater audience that consists mainly of people of the court. But there you see the process from very, very near, described by Molière better than any sociologist could ever do. And moreover, it's very entertaining. So we see that the bourgeois take over a certain way of living, of dealing with emotions, which implies, for example, a psychologization of the way of dealing with others. Oh, forever asking yourself, what are motives, what are the emotions, what should I display? And this is basically where Norbert Elias situates the civilizing process, the process of civilization. And one of his major points is civilization, he writes this in the 1930s, is not something which is the natural heritage of Europeans, which they have always had and will always have, and now will gently and kindly bring to all those people far away who sadly lack in civilization. In other words, it is also a critique of the colonial project. Some of you know the word mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. France entered Africa and conquered half of Africa because it just wanted to civilize those Africans who were in dire need of civilization. And the idea was that they would develop more refined, more soft, more sophisticated manners. And they were indeed capable of imposing their ways of looking at the world on the many African elites who became the collaborators of the colonial regime. But the word civilisation in Africa is basically what justified colonization on that continent. So when I talk about Elias civilization theory in Africa, it feels very, very different. So, but Norbert Elias's idea is that civilization is not something that is bred into the European race, but a historical accident, which also can collapse. We'll come to that. So the idea is that in the course of the 19th century, more and more layers of the population come to live this civilized way of life in which you try, and this is very important, control your emotions, control your anger, control your lust, your passion. You could look at the entire Me Too movement as a civilizing movement in which women with more power than they used to have civilize men to better control their emotions and their impulses. So civilization is very much about impulse control and a softening of behavior. And what has to be controlled is certainly anger and certainly gluttony, hunger. So you learn to eat with a knife and a fork and not just grab a big piece of, put it in your mouth and then clean your hands in your own hair. All the ways of medieval, most pleasurable eating have to be controlled. You wait till you're being served, till the others have eaten. You control your appetite. Even if you do that, at least when you're not alone, you're eating with friends. There are many, many, many ways of handling eating and food, which imply a certain control, a certain, how should I say, ritualization of what happens. And you remember the voice of your civilizing mother teaching you not to spit, not to fart, excusez-le mot, and not to, burp is the word. and to control this entire eating. The same applies to physical anger and rage, to everything that has to do with toilets. You're not even supposed to talk about it. And the teacher who would want to go at length to carry on about the habits of toilet would find himself in a sort of strict, how far could he go into the details of how a civilized person takes care of matters. So you see, all of this has become, it's even difficult to talk about. Now, you were a very liberated crowd, but we would have a hard time in discussing the process of civilization of defecation. Oh, wonderful word, defecation. How civilized. It's one of those words you say when you are teaching a course, but you never say that in your own house. Control of the body. Making sure you do not smell, you do not make funny sounds. You sit in a nice way. You don't slump and hang, you don't lie on the floor. We are a fantastically civilized lot, and so are you. And by the way, a class, in a lecture class, is especially under an enormous pressure to control, for example, impatience and boredom. These are emotions I have heard some students sometimes experience. I'm not looking at anybody, but then you're supposed to hide that. You must make an interested. I know that students, even when they're almost asleep, can look as if they're interested. You're very good at that. Thank you. So this gives an idea of how, let me say, the civilizing process has taught us to regulate many, many bodily, emotional impulses and become well-adjusted, civilized, nice persons. And you know better than I that it is quite a burden. And this is the idea of nice is a process that went on parallel with state formation, courtly society, and we should add another enormous civilizing machine, education, where you're taught to sit still, be silent, not to talk, to not put your finger in your nose or behind or whatever. Constantly in elementary school, you're being civilized. And so when you come home, your father and your mother civilize you. And if you don't do well, you feel very ashamed and embarrassed when you get to grow older and feel that you have internalized. So there we have a picture of, in first instance, European man. And I'm certainly not saying that these processes did not occur in other parts of the world in different manners, but Norbert Elias was a one-man show. He was not a research institute with 50 PhDs and 20 million in. He was just a man alone under very dire wartime circumstances who wrote this book. And as a consequence, we do not really know very much about other civilizations. Think about the Indian courts, Japanese courts, Chinese courts. We know almost nothing about African courts. We know almost nothing about Aztec and Maya courts, except the mythology that suits us very well, that they took the heart out of their victim and ate it. But that is what the Spanish like to tell us because it was a very good justification for the mass violence they imposed on the original population. So there is much we don't know, and I agree that Elias's account is Eurocentric. And for example, the part I added about the meaning of civilization in Africa, that was not on his mind in his time, but that must still be research. You must be aware that this is a limited, geographically, culturally limited view. And I hope some people among you will one time add with you from the different parts of the world. Why do I start out with this? Because it paints a sort of European citizen of the States that is about as far removed of mass violence as you can imagine, almost the opposites at first sight. And Norwich Elias, when confronted with mass violence in a book about Germany, Studies of the Germans, talks about the Zusammenbruch der Zivilisation. Who of you knows German? You do. You do. Who of you knows French? You do. Yes. Okay. Because there are other languages beside English, as some of you know. And the Zusammenbruch der Zivilisation means the collapse of civilization. So his idea was that Germany, Nazi Germany, civilization collapsed. And he had to think that if he could in any way account for the mass extermination of the Jews and so many other people during the Second World War. But we'll get to see if that is a tenable point of view. Now, these civilized, educated citizens shaped by the states, Staatsbürgers, citizens of the states, we must add another point of view to that. Apparently succeeded in developing very strong feelings about other people and about their own. So one process which we now want to look at is the formation of very strong group feelings and very strong complementary feelings about people who were not in the group. In other words, we feelings and them feelings. And the hostility, the anger that may be implied. And I should say the love and solidarity that go operate between the weak people. The way of looking, of going about this is to look at it in terms of what I call identification. Now, most what is being said about identification, you have read about under the heading identity. You love the word identity. It is one of the most essential words to the contemporary sensitivity. My identity is, what is my, I'm not going to tell you, you guess. Why do I make it identification? Because I don't like the suggestion in the word of identity that it is like a little hanger that hangs around your neck and there's a little thing that's close to you, unchangeable, given to you at birth, not requiring any more than just look every once in a while at your little cross or your little Muhammad David or your little Islamic hand or whatever you got. I think identity is work. And therefore I take a verb, identify, and the product, the process of identification. I think it's hard work because most of you have multiple identities, shifting identities, contradictory identities, and hidden identities about which you feel uncertain, or you might even be ashamed about your identity. But you would certainly be very ashamed about the fact that you were ashamed about it, because one is supposed to be proud of one's identity. I have no idea why, but you're supposed to be proud of your identity. So, congratulations, be proud. So, in a way, there are many contradictions and changes, and therefore, identity is a work and it's a process. And you could call it the work of identification. And the typical thing is that identifications very much proceed by us against them. We are nice people who belong together, who are loyal, who understand one another. You don't even need a health word. We know how to cook prawns or how to skew prawns because they're not kosher. There is a sort of spontaneous understanding. At least there is the suggestion of spontaneous understanding. There's a feeling of intimacy and belongingness and maybe even warmth. Now, you guys are in your late or early 20s. You may be trying to discard some identifications and get rid of them and develop new ones. So you may be more sensitive to the idea that it is work and full of contradictions than most people, for who it goes without saying. So identifications tends to celebrate the fact that we belong together, that we are more like one another than those guys over there, that we are better than those people over there, and that those people there are uncouth and rude or maybe pretentious and full of shit, or that they don't really understand what it is to be a working class person, or that they cannot dance and sing spontaneously. There are all sorts of ways people talk about the outsiders, and basically their idea of who they themselves are is very much shaped by the negative they portray of the other people. Who are we? Well, we're not nationalists. We're not aggressive. We are well-controlled, steady citizens. Look at those people. They're a disaster. Don't even want to. So this is the work of identification and disidentification. And the upper crust makes itself more upper by having ideas about what they call lower class people. But lower class people who call themselves folk or ordinary people or common people without pretensions, normal people, have all sorts of ideas about the highly educated snobs and the rich. So this work you could call identification, and its opposite, disidentification. Disidentification is the work. Those people over there are different. They're not like us, and they're no good. They make. And it's interesting to see that in many of these projections, I already said the word, you can sometimes find that the other people from whom you disidentify are ascribed exactly the emotions and the impulses that we, the in-group, do not want to have. We don't want to be sensual, not too sensual. But those people are lascivious. You should know about those women, what they do. And those men you can trust. We are above material goods. We're very noble, intellectual people. We don't care about money. Wait till you see those. The only thing they think about is money. They count money. So this is the way you deal with out groups and in groups. That's also very important. It's a little work which is done in conversations, in fantasies, and it's very effective. Shame and the idea that you ascribe to the other person or the other group the emotions and the impulses that you do not allow yourself is called projective identification. So I'm not, she is so jealous of me. And an outside observer thinks, well, I'm not so sure she is so jealous of you, but I have a feeling that you are very envious and that you never owe up to it. So that is what you call projective identification. And that is very much a part of what goes on between groups in which one group disidentifies from the other and identifies with its own. Now, there is an interesting generalization you can make about identifications and disidentifications. And that is that in the course of human history, the circles of identification have extended. Initially, people lived in very small groups, hunting and gathering groups, a few dozen or 100. And the work of identification comprised one's own hunting and gathering group. And then the next group, yeah, those were people who only hunted rabbits. They were all, we hunt lions. As you can see, I have never been part of such a hunting and gathering group, but maybe they work in terms of rabbits and lions, who knows? And then during once people settled and created agrarian communities, which are affected 10 larger, couple of thousand, you get much larger groups which identify with one another and ascribe negative characteristics to the next town. Very, very telling is, for example, how football fans strongly, really emotionally identify with their team, which is often connected to the city of a town, and despise the next town. There you can see not only are the circles of identification extending, but they're also concentric, because today I identify with the football team of my own urban area, Amsterdam Oost. Next week, when the competition goes on, I support the All Amsterdam team Ajax against Feyenoord, because I have a profound hatred of Feyenoord. Those people are terrible. And you can, sometimes it expresses extreme forms of hatred. And then when Feyenoord wins, which is awful and spoils my weekend, Feyenoord goes next to the, I'm not very good at this, Europa Cup or something. You don't know it either. Okay, but Europa Cup, yes, I know. And then we suddenly all for Feyenoord, because Feyenoord represents the Netherlands. And we might even identify with Europe, a European team against those awful Latin American teams, who always simulate that they are that they have an injury and they will root against the arbitrator. And anyway, they play an awful kind of football, etc., etc. So you can have concentric circles of identification, and consecutively you find yourself identifying with the team that was your opponent last week. And you can have ever extending circles. And so from the villages of agrarian regimes, you go to the cities of later kingdoms. And so some of us might even already, most of us have very strong national identifications, even though we may be critical of them, but you feel that you're Dutch or French or Indian or what have you. And then at the same time, you have many sub-identifications with smaller, or you may have even a family identification. Are, for example, called the Leon, And it's undeniable, the Leons, you always recognize one another. And yes, we're very good at mathematics. All of us are either in bookkeeping or in university as mathematicians. That's typically us, the De Leons. And wait till you meet the Castros, who hate the De Leons, but they're married with even one reason more to hate each other. And they compare themselves with the De Leons, etc. You know all this from family. It's work. It's done in conversation. It's done in gossip behind your back. It's very much connected with shame and embarrassment, but also with pride. And it is the mechanism and the glue with which we bound together, but also the toxic element which separates us from the other. And sometimes that can be built up to enormous hatred for huge groups. And the strange thing is, you may not know a single Sama or a single Roma, used to be called Roma, the Roma nation, and yet have very strong ideas about Roma. You really think they should not be allowed in the Netherlands? No way. And actually, if they are there, it would be a much better idea to put them away in a camp. They will feel better themselves among one another. And we should certainly not have them in schools because it will make them uppity and they won't understand what's going on. That's it. For their own best, it would be a very good idea to have them all, etc. You can see how these things are done. All right. I think it's time to have a little break.
Everyone is settled. So, okay. Do you have any questions? Let's start with you.
I had the slide, I'm not sure if that's actually the case, correct me, but you disapprove a bit of the modern identity politics or also identification. And I thought, wouldn't it be helpful to have unique identities and unique identification? That people would like to have found in like rural surroundings, like here in Amsterdam, because then we don't have in groups and out groups that much because everyone is unique and strives to be unique, whether that's good or not. But maybe it's good again, like.
You talk identity politics, and you thought, does he disapprove of it? Now, the kind of identity politics we have today, and which is covered by this term, is of course obviously these are all identities which feel, and mostly, I think rightly so, discriminate. So this is obviously emancipatory identity politics, wouldn't you? And I do not disapprove of emancipatory politics. I have sometimes my doubts whether, let me explain like this. Out of all these identitarian groups, we should somehow make a coherent political front. And now it is fragmented in so many identity groups which define themselves on the basis of a rather one-dimensional identity, which often find it hard to find common ground, for example, with working class people especially, and with other groups which are some, say, immigrant groups who find it very difficult to understand what this identity politics in the narrow sense is about. And mostly the identity people in these identity politics, certainly they say, for example, I am a non-binary queer. And this is, my group are NBQs. I'm making it up a little bit. Forgetting that in the meantime, they also ex-Catholic or Muslim or immigrants from Italy, or they may have had polio and they are the latest group now having joined the identity politics people with the handicap, challenged people. So even those people who put one particular form of identity very much at the fore have multiple and shifting identities. And part of being so hard being able to do NBQ, I made that up, is that you dearly love your parents and they don't understand. And then you feel very much connected with this group of Italian immigrants where you're from, and they don't understand LBQ. And there you have two conflicting identities. That's very normal. And it makes for a lot of hard identity work to maintain these different identities.
Let's try to take 2 or 3 questions in one go.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay. Let's start with you.
Can I the first one is, so that makes it kind of like part of the reason the conflict that arises from identity politics is because there's some kind of inner conflict first, so there's some kind of dilemma that then creates tension and leads into further conflicts that happen between people then. So that would be the first question. And then the second question is, you kind of created this model of identification that has identification that you do to yourself. Where
Your own we group?
Yes, you have this process of identifying your group, and then you have this process of identifying some other group, which is the projective identification.
Disidentifying, yes.
Yeah, so disidentifying. And I don't really know if you've included any kind of mechanism for how the identification that other groups put onto you affects the way you self-identify.
Yes, of course. Yeah. For example, it's very difficult to give innocent examples because it's a very mixed company, and it's very difficult to have find an example which nobody would feel. But let's say there is a group called the X's, and people say they never come on time. And you know that that's what's being said about X's. So you try to be on, I'm always late, so this is of me. You try to be on time so that you won't be looked at as a typical X. Yeah, that exists. Yes. Part of the shame that is always attached with any we feeling. There is almost no we feeling that is not also embarrassing.
Let's follow up.
Yes.
Okay. Great.
So the thing I was wondering is whether you include that, because you have these two things, your identification and your projective identification. Yes. So do you include that in some way, or is that just an extra special case that you can found?
No, this is a nice complication which you have picked up, that we sometimes try to adjust ourselves in the negative view, which others, for example, you try to come on time, because people always say about X's like me, that we're always late. Yeah, that exists. But in general, most feelings of identification are connected with pride and love and warmth and solidarity, but there is also shame and embarrassment, because you always also look through the eyes of the other group who think, well, all they do is eat together and sing. And the singing and eating together is great fun, but you know that other people criticize you for it. So shame and embarrassment are part of, and very interesting, double shame, because you must be proud of your identity. You are ashamed that you are ashamed.
Earlier on, you said that the presence of the state or a government can often have a part in mass violence.
Yes.
So I want to ask, would I be correct if I concluded that mass violence can be amplified if you have a government in charge?
Yes. Yes. Allow me to tie together the two things I presented in the first 45 minutes and tie a ribbon around it. The identification with the nation state is among the strongest identifications there are. And it is especially that identification and the others who belong are not people of the state, do not belong to the nation. They are the identified others, and often become the mortal enemy. So in the contemporary world, identifications having to do with states and disidentifications having to do with an outsider minority in the state or belonging to another state nation are among the strongest feelings. And I thought that was dissipating a little bit. But it is suddenly strengthened enormously because there are so many populist and authoritarian right-wing movements who take the Pope as a nation as the central entity to which we should all belong, and those who do not belong to it, who do not deserve to belong to it, are the sworn enemies. I think you know what I'm talking about.
A second, maybe somebody else wants to pick up on this or on the first set of questions before we give the voice to the faculty. Yep. Okay.
About evaluation, and you use a lot of it to proctor before we and then you kind of transition to the discourse of we and us feeling.
Yes.
And then feeling. And I was wondering where do you, in this mechanism, you add the moment where you transfer it's proper, it's better, it's good. You put that in a moral framework. So a moral framework.
Yes.
The person who presents the group is not only saying improper and the customers are not ours and not. Two, they're bad people. They're evil.
Yes.
How does that enter the mechanism? Because I think that in the hatred, we want to kill people because they think and you add death to the
Well, I think it is a ball of different feelings of disgust, contempt, hatred, fear, and also moral condemnation. For example, the others are, as you know, well, you are aware, I'm almost always speaking between quotation marks. The others are dirty, they smell, that's wounds and so. And because they don't wash the way we wash, they must be morally inferior. So this is not a very tight philosophical argument, but that is how it works. And we'll come to this later. In this process of distanciation, of ever stronger identification and disidentification of the outgroup, occurs a process which I have called a compartmentalizing process, in which life and society and private life and even thinking is divided up in separate compartments. And you wouldn't want to be near those people. I wouldn't want to be seen, caught dead with those people. Those people give me the creeps. I'm not making this up. It's really this part of the process. I'll give you one famous example. In 20th century Germany, there was a lot of discussion about homosexuals, quite similar to discussions we now have about transgenders. A number of sexologists had suddenly defined homosexuality, which before was rather, how should I say, undefined. Some men were funny and had strange predilections. But now it was a subject of scientific research and you had homosexuals and all sorts of theories. And this created sort of an anxiety in early 20th century Germany. And the idea was, by sexologists, a healthy German man, when he is exposed to a homosexual, actually feels the creeps. His hair stands up, you feel a vitale Abkehr, a vital disgust. So if you didn't feel that, there might be something the matter with you. You see how this works. And so people told each other, oh yes, when I see one of those creepy homosexuals, I think it's horrible. And then that was under the Nazi regime transposed by Jews. And you couldn't even tell who was a Jew because as a healthy Aryan German, you had the creeps to be in their vicinity. Why do I take this example? It's part of an answer. This is not just an intellectual reasoning or a political argument. The states and the nations succeed in creating their citizens to such degree that it is a physical experience. And if you don't have the physical experience, there might be something wrong with your heterosexuality or your Aryan purity. I'm warning you. So this becomes a vitale bodily experience, which creates a fantastic distance between groups. We'll get to talk about that.
If you don't have that, then you have to perform it sometimes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you have to convince yourself that you have
yourself and others, yes,
Yes.
that you have it.
Yeah.
Okay, I've seen some questions on this side. Yeah.
The idea that we define our identities by group membership.
Yes.
And one of the problems with this theory was like, because there's some group identities that's like, for example, I identify with this football team.
Yes.
Not all of these group identities erupt into violence. So
No.
it's like the operating factor, the interference of the state and actually
Yes.
informing these group dynamics.
Yeah. I mean, mass violence, keep in the back of your mind genocide, but there are a number of reasons why I avoid it. But that's everyday language. We're talking about genocide. And the scale of it is only commensurate with one of the largest institutions that we have, state. If you really want to kill hundreds of thousands or millions of people, you need government subsidy. And the state obviously is capable of forming its citizens through all sorts of mechanisms into the people of the regime against the target people,
Let's see if there's any other question. I mean, we have a very interesting discussion about transition from kind of certain stereotypes to normativity, regimes of normativity. And the state seems like an essential player in here. But okay, before I have any other questions, maybe. Okay, first you and then second.
So I understand that it's on violence, so it's interested in violence. But for example, would you include something like riots that happen? Like there was a recent documentary about the Woodstock 99.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, and so that's an instance. If you include that as didn't have violence?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, why not?
Not sufficient victims.
Okay.
Yeah, but
Then my question.
yes, a very unfortunate but rather spontaneous on the spot group incident. Yes.
So pogrom would not be your.
Well, there have to be a lot of simultaneous pogroms.
Yeah, macro pogrom. Okay.
I don't even wake up under 100,000 victims. You can't wake me up.
Well, okay. okay, go on.
I'm sorry to identify that the state, the government, central mass killing.
Yes.
Then wouldn't the quickest solution to ending mass violence be to reject the authority of the state, or would we somehow like sort of maybe discard or disempower to
Yeah, the state is double-faced. It is the keeper of the peace, and without a state, we might be at each other's throat or cheating one another or whatever. This is the idea that it holds the monopoly of legitimate violence in a given territory, Max Weber. On the other hand, it's also the greatest concentration and accumulation of lethal power in the world. So there's a double aspect. And if this lethal power turns against other states, we call it war, like what's going on right now between Ukraine and Russia. But if it turns against unarmed and unorganized citizens, then it is the greatest killer of them all. Yes. I won't join your anarchist party, partly because I don't give it much of a chance, and partly because, yes, the state is also the great guarantor of our security and the great shaper of who we are, citizens of the state.
Anyone? Yes, I would like to make sure that those people who have not asked the question, so get that to you. Okay, Eric.
So, sort of conveyor of the
Of what? Yeah. Right.
And so in the practice terms, what role, because the areas when you he argues that Python played a big role in the fact that where values were important of the Germans and that's why the Germans were then ready when the right messages came in from their state, their government, and so on, for to respond and further questions, right? So, do you think really for, and that there are certain cultures that would never engage in this kind of stuff, that there are certain cultures that by definition have a higher or lower culture. And when the government says this is appropriate, like Hitler did, and suddenly changed the logic of appropriate for its citizens, and suddenly it became appropriate to hate you, or like brave, that then you can trigger people in a different way, and it's cultural hand. That there are certain cultures who would never, and that is like after the Second World War, that Mussolini couldn't do that. That Mussolini was able to trigger that kind of violence. He triggered, yes, okay, but didn't trigger violence.
In German terms, Mussolini was never a good anti-Semite.
Yeah.
But in Italian terms, he did pretty well.
Yeah.
Well, the question is, what is the role of culture? And in his book, Studies of the Germans, Norbert Elias repeats what he first. The interesting thing is that he puts these great secular transitions of mentalité in rather concrete context, for example, the court society. And here he repeats that, I'd say disrespectfully, this way of operating by putting it in the context of the Burschenschaften, the fraternities. And in the fraternities had a highly militaristic, conflict-oriented tradition in which you had to have the Schmeister, is that the word? Schmeister. Yeah, you had to have these, what do they call them?
Cuts.
Yeah, there's a word. Cicatrices in French. What is that in English? Scars.
Scars.
So an upper-class German young man had scars from the duels they fought with their sabers in these fraternities, Burschenschaften, and they would go into the officers' training. That was all part and parcel of. And then there was, of course, the great lie that the German army had lost the war not because they were defeated, but because they had had a Dolchstoß in Rücken, a dagger in the back, and that was by the socialists and Jews, and that was why a strong German army was betrayed and lost. And so basically the military elite was the victim of world Jewry and socialist trickery. I find it difficult. I'm not entirely convinced by Elias's argument, because we could also say Germany was the country with the largest social democratic and communist workers' labor movements of all countries.
High levels of acceptance of the Jews,
Sorry?
integration of the Jews.
And there, of course, the Jews were completely integrated in this socialist, left socialist, communist, which until became the major supporters of the Weimar Republic. Of course, culture plays a role. By the way, Norbert Elias writes a beautiful essay about culture and civilization, saying that in the German mind, the French had civilization, but that was superficial. That was all about good manners and behavior and being well-spoken and funny. But the Germans had culture, and that was something very deep, understanding Beethoven and listening to Schubert and feeling the roots and the poetry of German nature poetry, and other people would never understand that. And therefore they might have not such a brilliant court culture, but they had the profundity of the German soul. And this entirely has been taken over by Putin about the Russian war. The war that is going on in Putin's terms is not about the German, it's about the Russian soul, about the purity and the profundity and the closeness to history and nature of the Russian soul. Would you agree? I see it.
Definitely, it's always about it. The Ukraine as the alternative Russia, in a sense, yeah. The Russia as it could be.
That, no, in a way, Ukraine is the real Russia, which must be liberated.
One of the
Ukraine.
aspects of the Ukrainian
very
nationalism. Yes,
complicated.
yes.
It's terribly
It
complicated.
is interesting too.
They shouldn't have gone to war, they should have broke it up.
Well,
Yes. Yes.
The people were sent from concentration camps
Yes.
before. Literally, that's what we take. They were removed from the fight.
Yes.
In Frankfurt, that was also. So take this.
Yes.
Security said we got our things.
Yes.
And so, how do you explain, how do you, in the state, people had such control over the system that it's able to decide the fate of a full population and determine what the citizens would think of that population? Or is it not?
This question is so much too difficult for me that I'll answer it with a joke. Basically, what I think is that these are Catholic countries, and the Catholic Church said, we have been anti-Semites for 2,000 years, leave it to us. And all this Nazism is exaggeration, unnecessary, they're pushing it too far. That's basically what I think.
okay. Yes. And French cases.
Is productive, or do you think it contributes to something else?
I missed one of your first words. Do you think that?
The role that feelings of revenge play
Yeah.
in the integration of minorities and other groups, is it productive or kind of like continuing the cycle of violence?
These are feelings of revenge among what sort of minorities?
Towards their oppressors.
colonized or with the colonizers.
Yeah, that is very hard to tell. Generally, oppressed minorities, when they're liberated, do not tend to be very revanchist. For example, South African blacks have taken very little revenge, and the fears of South African whites that all their throats would be cut, it never happened. There must be counterexamples. Obviously, Maxim is a counterexample.
No. All kinds of situations. You want to follow up on
Yeah,
this? Okay.
Very helpful.
Okay.
I agree with South Africa, I think, would be an exception, and even specifically the party that made them hate South Africa is an exception. So Nelson
The
Mandela,
ANC.
yeah, the ANC. Nelson Mandela had this whole narrative of the Red Nation. That's a really important thing for getting the negotiations to happen, for getting the NP to come to the table for negotiations, and for getting democracy to happen. And a lot of the decisions that were made in terms of land reform, for example, that ended up going into the interim constitution and then later into the constitution, happened because they were necessary for the negotiations to continue, not necessarily because there was this desire for revenge. And you still get parties like, for example, the PFF, who are strongly for land reform, and the PAC, which is now kind of less relevant, but was very much for some kind of revenge.
Land reform is not quite the same as revenge.
Yeah, but it is close to it's closer to completely reforming the system. And while it's not malicious, if that's the aspect of revenge that you're talking about, I think it shares some aspects of revenge in terms of altering the system and taking back certain things. And for example, the PAC had lots of revenge politics in mind. They just didn't have power because they disagreed with what the ANC was doing in negotiations. And yeah, there are lots of, if we just take nations, the post-colonial nations as an example, although there are other minority groups as well, there are lots of post-colonial nations that did like engage in forms of revenge politics. And
Do you guys understand what our French says?
yeah, exactly. Like the land.
After liberation of colonized countries, there were instances of large-scale lethal revenge. Yeah. For example, an episode of very, very lethal revenge was when the Soviet army marched into Central Europe, and basically the German army had to withdraw. There was a vacuum between these two huge armies, and there about 12 million German-speaking people, there are all sorts of different German-speaking people, were caught between the two, and at least 1 million died, and in great part in all sorts of revenge operations, which, by the way, were condoned by the Polish and Czech governments. There's a mass instance of mass killing, which sort of served the goals of the Czech and Polish governments rather well, because they wanted to get rid. They were ethnic. It was ethnic cleansing. Just that the Germans have lost the war, that it was for years and years very difficult to even mention this unless you were an ex-Nazi. I mean, then you were already an ex-Nazi. You talked about it, and but still, that was a tragedy, and it was revenge, and there was a plan behind it.
To come back to as a question, is that going to a vicious cycle? For example, you can see that now Germany is trying to blame the Russian invasion by, for example, in former concentration camps, displaying a Russian translation and the German text, but no other translations, but like directly the Russian translations and those camps where the Russians after the Second World War also killed people. I'm not sure if that's already part of the revenge, but I think it's the starting of a cultural revenge. And do you think that goes into a vicious cycle then?
Well, let's take, for example, Balkan countries. What happens in Bosnia? there you have a feeling that this goes on and on and on. And during the Second World War, the Croats and the Serbs were at each other's throats in a way that literally made the SS who were watching turn pale. It was horrible. And that has been going on and on and on. Yes, that is a cycle of revenge. But in its generality, I would find it difficult to answer.
Propose an alternative. Do you think things like disarmament programs and truth and reconciliation commissions, like all of these kinds of initiatives that are designed to change the culture behind, let's use liberation movements as an example here, and to kind of change the warring mentality and change the fighting mentality into one of reconciliation. All of these kind of mechanisms, do you think those are ways to kind of stop that continuous cycle? Use the revenge as a way to keep, or kind of the maliciousness, the desire for some kind of action against an oppressor to drive a liberation movement, and then once you've got some kind of agreement that you're happy with, you use these other mechanisms to kind of stop the culture development.
But to take again the example of South Africa, of course, South Africa had the great luck of having Nelson Mandela, who is a very special kind of person. But he could only be a very special kind of person. You can only be a saint or a messiah if you have believers. He could have done it alone. There were millions and millions of white, but especially black and colored people who recognized what Mandela was doing and gave him this fantastic support. I think, but I don't know, maybe you know better, that here Christian ideology played a role, and the idea of reconciliation and trying to live with your brothers, etc., and Rainbow Nation, which already implies that ultraviolet and red have something in common, that they're all part of a large spectrum. That's the idea of rainbow. This must have appealed to them. And I wonder if in the Congo that would have helped much appeal against Belgium.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because the Egyptian survivors where they want majority. But I promise you, if he comes, we can win an election. I will need you. You have to win in the next meeting now. And you know, I think it was not so much that they wanted to reconciliation of heaven, but that they realized that the pragmatic they couldn't win the war. They didn't have visas. You made the point. They didn't have weapons. They didn't have enough soldiers. They didn't have trained people, so they couldn't win that war. But they could win the election if they even say like. And so, you know, I think that was the tipping, you know, the tipping. And I don't know, you know, if in other situations, that will work. And for that, I think again, we're coming back to the question of culture, because when you think of all people, DDRR, they are aimed at changing the cultural war. They're aimed at changing and inducing cultural change that acceptance can replace what you are describing there.
Well, of course, this identification process is not a omnipresent law of nature. Otherwise, we would be at each other's throats all the time. We must explain under what conditions that can occur. But of course, South Africa must be grateful that it had Mandela and so many people who understood Mandela, but there was also de Klerk. And de Klerk is a very different person from Netanyahu.
There was Gorbachev instead of Milosevic. And that was the role of personality in history, but I think just, if I may, I mean, don't we have a kind of a debate here when we try to figure out the conditions of how this accelerates into mass violence between, to simplify, culture and state, where you put the weight, to some kind of, cultural traditions or to the agency of the state, because there are states, for example, allies of the Nazi Germany that for their own citizens reserved certain degree of monopoly on violence and did not try to resist sending, for example, their Jews to the Holocaust. Hungarian state or Italian state until a certain moment, and so on. Bulgarian state was actually quite successful in doing that.
And Romania was very collaborative,
But it's not about culture, because they didn't send Macedonian, for example, Jews to Holocaust, because they were not citizens of the state. So in this case, the citizenship actually was this mechanism by means of which lots of millions of lives were saved. So here, and where state was totally demolished, like Poland, that was where the Holocaust was happening. It was totally demolished. Even the name was erased. Two more questions, and then we should wrap up. Yes, you have your first. Okay. Well, it is a kind of ideal types. I mean, if we go to the mechanisms, then of course they are entwined, but on the level of where we put our weight, in a sense.
Culture and the people pointing to the state.
Yes, but there are resources within culture that can be mobilized in this or that direction. Germany was, and that's an argument against, for example, Elias' argument. I don't know if you agree. For example, Randall Collins was very much critical of this culturalist argument with respect to Germany, saying that in fact Germany did offer the most modern and most universalistic kind of mechanisms of cultural and political, but like bureaucracy, for example, which was could work in both ways, but it could work also to prevent this kind of mass violence. Just contingency of loss of war, coming of certain people to power and things like that, turned those resources in a particular direction. You could mobilize those resources in this direction. It is also
talk about the militaristic culture in Germany, but that was of course exactly the state culture, because the army was an arm of the state. So you cannot mention that the state creates its citizens, for example, through the machine of education, which is a cultural conveying belt under state control. So we must not separate that. But it is there. You must not give undue weight to culture, but I don't know what is undue. I mean, in every situation you have to decide for it. Very after all, the French have a rather militaristic something to Brits.
They've been split, along this distinction since at least the times of Dreyfus affair. And then it kind of recurs, and recent elections also split the nation almost in equal parts. Okay, one more question, maybe somewhere from the audience who had not had a chance to pose their question. So one more from you, one more from the audience.
I think South Africa and post-colonial nations in general, but I know specifically about South Africa, it might actually be a nice example of the state having quite a heavy hand in culture of creation, because the culture that exists in South Africa currently, the national culture, what you think about it when you're a South African citizen as being South African, is very much generated by the whole, partly by the negotiation process, there's some like carryover there, partly by the teaching of the history of apartheid, partly by leftover structures from apartheid, but in large part from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the new constitution, all of these things that go into like the character of South Africa. And in that sense, I think I agree with Pat entirely that there's this intertwining of state and culture that you really can't separate.
I was at Stellenbosch in the great row over Afrikaans, as a teaching language, are to do with that. Well, it's, you see the unmaking of Afrikaner gum. Yeah.
Okay, one more question from the silent majority. People who haven't had a chance. Or they kind of, sometimes people have, I actually have the same tendency to wait until the end to formulate. My question kind of ripens only to the end of the session, to the extent that sometimes there's really no time for it. Sometimes.
If you had a question, what would it be? You're yeah. Yeah, I was curious. Yeah. Okay. So you got an answer. Yeah. All right.
Oh yeah, just one more question, and then maybe we'll show the books, yeah,
Sure.
before we.
I have a little trouble understanding you because you talk so quickly. I couldn't close it.
So the article kind of touched upon how human rights rhetoric can be very limiting in the sense that there's the existence of the non-human black body, and how when we work within a human rights framework, we're kind of leaving out this group of people who are not necessarily on a universal scale identified as human, and so what this definition of humanness actually is. And I was just wondering if you think, like, in relation to mass violence, if we're working to protect the large majority or minority from mass violence in a human rights framework, if that's limiting, and if it would be more beneficial if we worked in more of a decolonial framework to deal with these issues, considering that issue of there is the existence of the non-human body.
Okay. This is about the question which human beings are human or not. And whether, if I understand right, black people at some point were considered not to belong to the human race.
There's just, I think that there's from a lot of minority groups and in the household, it kind of discussed the existence of like the non-human body, not necessarily just people of color in that sense, and just on different identification groups, and how some groups don't feel they fit into this idea of human and the protection of human rights.
All right.
Yeah.
Now, what article was that?
I think it was called Roads Must Fall. Roads Must Fall.
Rhodes, Cecil Rhodes.
Yeah.
And his statue. Yeah. Of course, yeah. Yeah, you could say that throughout modernity, the European explorers, who were the front troops of the European colonizers, posed the question whether these indigenous people in Latin America or in Africa, or for that matter in India, were human beings in our sense. Well, they looked like human beings, they talked like human beings, they walked like human beings, but were they really human beings in our sense? I remember a beautiful account by a British explorer, and he was offered, written in 16th century English, a number of black women with cords around them, but scantily dressed. And the African king said, "Don't you want these people?" And then the British explorer said, "No, because they are people like us, and we don't trade in people." 20 years later, the slave trade began, and they traded enthusiastically. But this captain refused, recognizing the essential humanity that people are not to be traded. So he understood that these, what you call black bodies, were human bodies like his. Slavery was only possible by very hard disidentification work of making those people who looked so human, who felt so human, inhuman, and not qualifying for human rights, such as not to be traded, not to be deported. So throughout European modernity, there is hard work in deciding who can. For example, Christian people had a hard time denying that people who understood the Bible and who understood what Christ was all about should have no souls. But sometimes they succeeded in denying that those people, enslaved people, had souls like they had. So all this is hard, emotional and intellectual and moral. It's also hard work to deny people's humanity because they look so human. I'd almost pity. So this was a controversy. Yeah. Why do you call them bodies? Why are they bodies? That was your word.
That was the word in the article.
I know. I'm against that. I think you should call persons persons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rhetoric is really important in this world because if you don't, it can be very limiting to a lot of people. And it's just more of a sense, is the human rights framework the proper framework in avoiding violence or
Well, of course, under the guise of human rights or under the guise of, for example, Christianity or maybe Islam, horrible distortions, I can only use the word distortion, of the teaching have been committed. But in the great religions and in human rights ideology, we take the view that everybody who looks like a human being is a human being with the rights, and the word soul in a way means the right to respect. That's what we don't know about the other world, but if you say somebody has a soul in this world, you mean she's entitled to respect.
We should kind of get close to wrapping up. Maybe one more question, then we'll show you some books. So maybe you can also consider maybe reading something before the next session, just for yourself. It's not an assignment, it's not a class, but that's that would be a good idea. You might not to consider those books, and then we'll join for a month, until our next session on perpetrators. More specific topics.
This is kind of a question we want to ask, but it seems kind of strange to be separating human rights theory from. And I think why the separation is there, because I think I've read articles that are similar to that coming out of South Africa specifically, talking about how the human rights framework is incredibly weaponized and mostly very issues, therefore it just ignores a bunch of things. But I don't necessarily see why the author of a paper like that would then toss out all of human rights. It seems like tossing out flavor with the bathwater a little bit, because there are a lot of things in human rights theory framework that are in fact just happen to have shown framework and also useful to that. So what is about the distinction that is made in that article between human rights?
I didn't read the article. Well, it is probably abhorrent to me, as you may know. This is there's something very wrong if you decide that. And I'm talking about such a, I don't mind if you call it soul, if you're a Christian or Muslim or Jew, or you call it human rights, but if you see a human being, you're also a human body, you must recognize that person, I call it a person, is entitled to the same rights, or if you wish, has a soul and should be treated like a human being. That is essential. And anything that denies that is a distortion of essential teachings. But very often what happens in the colonial situations is not the outright denial of the humanity of the colonized, but they are not yet ready to have the full human rights, to exercise the full privileges of a Christian believer. We must educate them, and we must elevate them. We must civilize these people who are like children, and we will be in lieu of parents. And in a couple of centuries, after having exploited the hills, they will also be capable of governing themselves the way we do. This is usually, there is sort of an evolutionary theory. You are not yet our equals, but one day you will become. That was considered progressive.
There's someone who has not had chance.
So you mentioned that mass violence, I guess it's a bit of a shift from the topic, but you mentioned that mass violence requires for you like a rough minimum of 100,000 people.
No, yeah.
But it can, like, I assume, over a long period of time. So I guess, all right, what would you then see about the average energy divide in the U.S. between the two very different identities, I guess Republican and Democrat in that, that seems to be bigger than the identity with the nation state, and the violence between these groups, these brutalities, black culture in water, gun violence, etc. Is it a slow mass violence, and is it a state turning on itself? How would you kind of point it because there's so many different events that are occurring that are violent, that kind of do all work together?
Well, let me turn to the basics. There are, I think, more than 1 million black and colored people in jails in the United States. There's not 1 million white Republicans in jails in the United States. So this is an asymmetric situation. There are constantly people being brutalized and arrested in the streets, often also by policemen of color. I mean, they're not all innocent. So there is a steady oppression of a large part of the population of color in the United States, even though there are many people of color who emancipated, became university students and professors. There still is a steady oppression going on at the popular classes of color. There's also economic oppression going on of people, of white people, which it is not the same thing. So I don't think that Republicans or even Trump Republicans are oppressed in any way. And I don't think most Democrats are being oppressed. But there is people of color and maybe indigenous people are. And we have to start from that fact in order to understand the dynamics of American politics.
Definitely, I would say that started out like with the board and the whole issue. Right?
Yeah.
That those rights are going away and they're trying to turn back
Yes.
to gay marriage and climate crisis things are going on. That in that sense, while not distancing at all or diminishing the suffering of people of color,
Yeah.
there is still the violence going on towards also many other identities and basically anyone lower class, almost towards Republicans internally that they just don't realize is caused by. It's like almost within the education kind of we'll teach you the one actually comes more. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah.
But I guess from the state it's hard to see because everyone is kind of getting in a very upper echelon armed.
as to where the math science is really going towards the side, it's easier, people, or I think there's more to it.
Mhm. What you're mentioning is that, for example, women are now seeing their rights being taken away from them. And homosexuals who had acquired the right to marry in same-sex marriages are seeing those rights threatened. Yes, certainly. But still almost all political means are open to them, and it is still a political struggle. Women are not killed. Some may die of accidents of abortion. But the game is still open. Let's see who wins. It's pretty worrisome.
Well, I think we do have to wrap up for today, and we still have 3 sessions. Don't worry about that. I mean, those of you who have accumulated and have developed questions that kind of flow out of this discussion, they have a chance to pose them next time. This is the same book, yeah, in English and in Dutch. It's the book that I mentioned earlier by our guest speaker today. And these are the works of Norbert Elias.
Yeah, I wanted to show them. These are this is the English edition. It took 30 years before it ever got translated. Partly because Norbert Elias was never satisfied with the translation. So he was his own worst enemy.
You know, and the most happy audience in the Netherlands. You know,
Oh, yeah.
there are lots of talented people who suddenly started together around him, and the whole school was formed.
Yeah.
You might say, and you were probably part of it. Definitely. Okay, so thank you so much for being here, for attending this session. I hope technologically it will be more sophisticated by next time, but we will have a recording, maybe a couple of parts of recording for this session, and so you might be able to show it to your friends who were not able to attend. Once more, thank you. And